What is up, my friends, and how's it going? And welcome to yet another video on your Factional Overview series with your fellow comrades summary. Of course, in this video we will be going with the winner of the YouTube community polls, that is none other than Roma. But Roma is an extremely massive faction, which means we will have to divide this guide into 3 videos. The first video I will be focusing on the starting armies of the early Roman Republic in the year 278 BC, which is of course the Camillan armies of the Roman Republic. Roma as a faction is a faction group of its own, and as such it has 2 buffs. The first buff is the Roman Legions, which gives +1 recruitment slot in all of your provinces. This is very important in the early game because you will be able to muster armies a lot faster than your adversaries, which is really crucial in the early game. However, in the mid to late game, when you're already an established superpower, it's not going to be that much of a boost to your overall game or your performance, because you're already overwhelmed, or you already have a significant advantage in terms of manpower and of course armies in comparison to your adversaries. So once you kind of get these ball rolling, it kind of snowballs with the Roman faction, and you only get stronger with time, especially if you play your early game in the right way. Next up we have the bread and circuses, which is again a very good boost in the early game. It gives +1 food in all of your provinces. In the early game, most of you who have seen my own Let's Play series on Roma and of course on any other faction, you will know that the early game tends to be a little bit tough because of course you are dealing with economy, you're dealing with food, and you kind of have to play out your provinces in a very balanced fashion. But however, as you progress and you acquire more territory, then you can afford to specialize your provinces. And I have received comments where people say they don't tend to specialize their province. They make every province kind of balanced in the sort of, it can be used as a recruitment province. It generates food, it generates income, and there's nothing wrong with playing that way. It's still a very viable way of playing. However, what I try to showcase is of course min-maxing everything, because not a lot of people know how to do that, and I am trying to release an educational kind of content so that people who are new to Divided Impera, or people who want to just hit the next level in terms of their own skill, can do so by learning something new. And of course people who also contribute to the community and to the YouTube channel by posting out comments. There's sometimes things that I even learn from you guys, so definitely thank you all for that. However, back to the bread and circuses buff, +1 food in all your provinces, as I was saying in the early game, very important because you don't have province specialization, which means food is going to be hard to come by in the early game. But if you own or you expand quite quickly, then you will have at least +1 food from all of your provinces. So you typically start out with 2 provinces, so you get +2 food. But as you expand into, let's say, Cisalpina, you take out Apollonia from the Impera faction, and of course you move into Sicily, Corsica and Sardinia. Now all of a sudden you have 6 provinces under your control, so you're getting +6 food, which is pretty massive in the early game, especially when you're not able to specialize any of your provinces. However, once you are in charge of Sicily, then you can pretty much convert Sicily, which is an amazing province, as a food province because of its 3 ports and the ability to have 3 fishing ports and of course 3 farms. Once that happens, once you've kind of spec'd up that province, then this buff is no longer that powerful or relevant, because you will be making all of your food plus surplus from just owning Sicily. So it's a very good buff in a very early game, but the minute you conquer Sicily and start to specialize Sicily into that food generation, this buff is not that impactful. So I would really like to see this change, to be honest. However, as the Romans, next up we're going to be talking about the different faction options. But as the Romans and the faction group of Roma already being a faction, you don't have faction options as the Romans. Instead, what you do have are the different gens or the families of the Romans, the patrician classes of course. And beginning with, you start with the gens Julia, and they have 3 modifiers of course. The first one being Barbarian Subduers, which gives increased melee attack during battles against barbarian tribes. It's quite useful if we kind of divide the world into 2 halves. So starting from the bottom left corner, we draw a diagonal to the top right corner of the map, and everything on this upper left hand side is all barbarians. So if you're thinking about Rome, upper left hand side would be Iberia, Gallia, the Alps, Germania up in the north, the Brittonic Isles, of course. All of these are barbarian, so it really applies to that half of the map. However, if you talk about the southeast or the bottom right corner of the map, then you're talking about the Carthaginians in the south, which are not barbarians. Of course, you're talking about the Diadochi, the Hellenic factions, and so forth. So really this buff is kind of situational depending on which direction you're going to be expanding. So it's not going to be applied to your campaign in its entirety, but it's going to be very situational depending on, of course, the opponent you're up against. Next up, we have a Romanization, and I'm actually going to cover that along with the cultural oppressors because they kind of cancel out each other. Cultural oppressors, while it gives increased public order penalties due to presence of foreign cultures, which is quite significant in the early game when you don't have a lot of public order buildings and access to better public order bonuses from your technology, is going to be quite significant debuff. However, thankfully you do have the Romanization, which means you will be able to culturally convert all of your provinces into Latin as quickly as possible. And of course, as Roma, you have a very special edict of Romanization which further boosts your cultural conversion, which I kind of recommend in the early game to kind of use it, because you really want to switch from from the base culture of those provinces into Latin, and Latin is not a very dominant culture in the campaign. In fact, as far as I know, I think only Latium and perhaps even Magna Graecia has Latin as a local tradition. Meanwhile, all of the other provinces, including Cisalpina, Sicily, all of these things which are considered modern day Italy, do not have Latin as a local tradition. So it's going to be hard to culturally convert provinces. Next up, of course, we have the gens Junior. These guys are more republican in nature. They have 3 modifiers again. The agriculturalist gives increased agricultural income, which is not that great in my opinion, because when it comes to income, I do believe that commerce and industry is far superior thanks to that commercial stimulation edict, in tandem with, of course, the slave market, with which, if most of you have seen my Let's Play series, you know that I can really generate astronomical incomes per turn, like somewhere around 200 to even 500,000 denarii per turn, which is absolutely insane. But none of that comes from agriculture. Instead, if I find a province with good agricultural resources like Sicily or Africa, or even Britannia up in the north with a lot of ports and so forth, I tend to prefer to use them as my food generation province, because once again, I like to province specialize. But if you're one of those players who play with with a balanced province setup and not a province specialized setup, then you kind of will be building cattle pens everywhere and so forth. So this kind of racks up, or kind of accumulates, and kind of helps out in that way. Next up, you do have the public order bonus from Latin culture, which is kind of nice, because of course eventually you will be converting everything into Latin culture. But the debuff is extremely significant. You have a moderate diplomatic penalty with all factions, and as Roma in the starting game, you are in a 2-front war against the Etruscans to the north, and of course Pyrrhus down in the south at Taurus. So you kind of have an issue with your diplomacy, because once you conquer them, then most likely Carthage is going to declare war against you. You're going to have a lot of factions ready to jump on you, to pounce on you, especially with this penalty. So you kind of have to be on your guard, especially have your border regions very well fortified, with a good garrison at the very least, if not a moderately sized army to protect or to intercept any possible threats, or to at least dissuade any enemies from, or potential enemies from, declaring war against you. Next up, we have the gens Cornelia. Now, the gens Cornelia are staunchly Republican and staunchly elitist, historically speaking. Of course, you had characters like Scipio Africanus, the famous general who defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, of course, and you do have the dictator Sulla, and even though he is a dictator, he was staunch Republican. He only assumed dictatorship to kind of reverse the gains made by the plebs, by the common class. So he was a part of the Optimates, which were pro patrician who wanted to kind of undo the reforms of later Roman political figures like Marius and so forth, and basically restore Rome to its original state when it was first founded as a republic. Of course, they have 3 modifiers: administrators, increased tax rate, which is quite powerful, especially in the early game, and it's still quite powerful in the late game because this bonus kind of applies. And for most of you who do know my economic setup, you know that I consider 3 main modifiers. Of course, you have the tax rate, you have the empire maintenance, and of course you have the income from your slaves. So these 3 things, if you kind of min-max them, then you can make insane amount of denarii per turn. So it kind of helps that you have that tax rate bonus as the gens Cornelia. Next up, you have the Philhellenes, which is basically a moderate diplomatic bonus with all Hellenic factions. Once again, that invisible line from southwest to northeast. Of course, everything on the lower half is going to be a lot of Diadochi, Hellenic kingdoms like Pergamon, Pontus, Athena, Sparta, Rhodos, and all of these kingdoms are going to be friendlier towards you. So it's kind of useful, especially if you want to focus up all your expansion towards the northwest. You can be pretty secure in the southeast, with the exception, of course, of Carthage. So once you take out Carthage, you kind of can ignore the entire Hellenic world until you kind of conquer the entire west. Of course, it's ahistorical in terms of chronology. But of course, in my own Let's Play series, I decided to go with a very historical expansion with some of the key historical events like the rise of Julius Caesar, the fall of Julius Caesar, and so forth. However, if you're just playing casually and you don't really care about expanding in a very historical faction, I see some people not even bother with taking over Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, go all the way north into Gallia as quickly as possible, and then all the way down into Spain, or maybe just focus so entirely in crushing Carthage, and so forth. So which is not entirely historically accurate in terms of chronology. Then this bonus is quite good because you can definitely add a direction to your expansion and not be too concerned about what's going on in the east. Next up, you have the disdain for the plebs. As mentioned earlier, these guys are staunchly Republican but staunchly patrician elitists. So they did not like the plebs. They were, butting heads with the populares, which was typically championed by the gens Julia, like Julius Caesar and of course Augustus, Octavian. These guys, on the other hand, were part of the optimates, the elitist patrician class. So they did not like the plebs. So what this means is that you get public order penalty from the presence of Latin culture, and this is kind of painful, especially in the early game. In the late game, where public order is never an issue, it should never be an issue, in fact, if you're playing your game right. But in the early game, public order is a really big thing to deal with. And that's because you don't have a lot of technologies to counteract public order. You don't have access to a lot of the higher tier buildings that can offer public order bonuses. So you really have to deal with public order in a much more difficult and efficient manner in the early game. And in the early game, what are the main sources of public order? One could be the slave, population that's causing public order. But apart from that, it's going to be mostly conquering foreign territory with foreign culture. Now, once you conquer that territory with foreign culture, you're getting public order due to foreign culture. However, as the gens Cornelia, your instinct is going to be to try to culturally convert the province into Latin so that you can deal with the public order issues. However, unfortunately, upon doing so, you're still going to be getting public order penalties due to the presence of Latin culture. So it's kind of like damned if I do, damned if I don't, right? So a very significant debuff, especially in the early game. Among the 3 families, of course, my personal favorite, the gens Julia, because I simply love Octavian, Augustus Caesar, and of course Julius Caesar by extension. But for me, it's all about Octavian, the first ever emperor of Rome, and the entire Principate era. But my close second would be the gens Cornelia, despite this massive penalty down south at the bottom over here. The gens Junior, it's not like I don't like them. It's just that in comparison to the other 2 families, not a lot of predominant historical characters kind of emerged from this party or this family. So not my cup of tea. I would rather like to roleplay as the Julia and focus on converting the Roman Republic into an empire, or I would like to play as the gens Cornelia and try to be staunchly Republican in my playthrough and tried to achieve the extremities of the Roman Empire, of course, but while retaining the Republican's playstyle. However, that being said, let us hop into the political traditions. It is a republic, which isn't ideal in my opinion. I like factions that begin with the monarchy, the kingdom, or the chiefdom. And that is because you can accumulate a very high influence, which makes it all the more easier to convert into an empire form. However, as a republic, you have to typically stay between 40 to 50 influence, and if you surpass 50 influence, then you will be slapped on with many negative modifiers that are going to be tough for your public order and so forth. But unfortunately, you need high influence, about a minimum of 65% influence, which is at least 15% more than that 50%, in order to convert your republic into an empire. So a little bit of a difficulty over there, considering their political tradition. And this political tradition doesn't change even if you change the government type, which is kind of a sad thing, to be honest. But that is not Divided Empire's fault. That's just how the base game is designed. Next up, you have these special systems, and boy oh boy, for the Romans, these are really special systems. We have the reforms for the Romans, which have 3 reforms, which is more than any of the reforms that any other faction have in the game. Of course, you have the Polybian reform, in which your Camillan armies are basically retaining their same manipular formation. However, they have a significant weapon change and a kind of ideological change in terms of their approach to warfare. Instead of a predominantly spear-based army, they're shifting or transitioning into a more melee-based army. Then after that, of course, you have the famous Marian reforms and the imperial reforms, and I'm gonna basically compare them side by side, because the imperial reforms is not much different from the Marian reforms. In fact, it's the exact same, with the exception, of course, each and every single equivalent troop, or the imperial equivalent for the Marian, is going to be better stats in terms of armor, and of course a few other things like weapon damage and so forth. So it's basically showing how much more professional the Marian armies got during the early Principate era. So pretty much the Augustan legionaries. So you'll not see a lot of those rectangular shields. Instead, you'll see a bit more of that hybrid between the early or the late Republican scutum and of course the late Imperial scutum, which was that iconic square semi or concave rectangle shield. What you have over here is kind of like a mix between the two. In any case, I digress. However, with that, we're going to go into these sections now, which I failed to mention earlier, but we are going to go into the sections of this video, and keeping in mind that this is the Roman faction, is going to be pretty massive, so I'm going to try to go through them as quickly as possible. Of course, we have that typical 4-part format. However, part 1 is going to be divided into 2. For those of you who don't know, part 1, we are going to be talking about the base roster available to the Roman faction. Of course, I'm going to be dividing it into 2 parts, because the Romans have this auxiliary system, which is actually the most important thing and is what makes Rome one of the best factions in the game, if not the very best in my opinion, is this auxiliary system, which gives you unlimited access, or virtually unlimited access, to pop 4 professional units. That's right, you have population 4 professional units, which makes expansion a lot easier as the Romans. However, when I cover part 1, which is the core roster of the Roman armies, I will have to divide it into further into 2 sections. First, I will be covering the core Roman infantry, and then of course I will be covering those units that are available through the auxiliary system. So with that, we are going to go through those 4 parts right away. Of course, the second part, we are going to be focusing on my personal army composition recommendation, and in the third part, we're going to be testing out that army composition. And usually what we tend to do is we tend to test them out against a typical Roman Marian legion. However, that's not going to be the case in this episode, because of course it makes no sense to use a Camillan Roman legion to fight off against a Roman Marian legion, because that would never happen in your campaign. You can't fight Roma against Roma. So what we will do for these 3 videos is that we will be fighting off against the era appropriate major rival of Rome. So if you're talking about the Camillan and the Polybian area, then that rival is going to be none other than Carthage. However, if you're talking about let's say the Imperial or Republican era, then the most famous adversaries would be, of course, the Gallic tribes. So we're going to be fighting off against the Averni. And in the Imperial, it could be, it could be anyone. It could be because at that stage, it's pretty much the same. And we don't really have a video covering the Imperial because it's pretty much the same as your Marian. However, that being said and done, let us hop into part 1, in which we will be covering the core roster available to the Romans, and in the second part of part 1, we will be talking about the auxiliary units available to the Romans before the Marian reforms. Alright everyone, welcome to part 1 of the guide, in which we will be covering the Roman roster in depth. Of course, this is the Camillan armies as arrayed in their typical formation. We begin with our general options, followed by our melee infantry, of which we have none in our core roster. And in the next group, we have our spear infantry, quite a lot of spear infantry, and followed by our phalanx type troops, followed by missile troops, and of course melee cavalry. We do not have any missile cavalry in our core Roman roster, of course. So as you can see, the base or the core Roman roster in the Camillan reforms is very limited in scope, but of course you do have access to a lot of auxiliary units, which is almost like 2 or 3 times the number of units that you see here in your screen. We're going to go through each of these units as quickly as possible because otherwise this video will take forever to complete. However, first up we have our generals group. We have the Camillians General Bodyguard, and for those of you wondering, the appearance is due to the Izuru Alexander's Legendary Empires submod, which I do recommend because the units look really nice. And of course this is a 100-man strong cavalry regiment. 9 melee attack, 30 melee defense, which is pretty mediocre if you ask me. Decent armor at a 41, which is pretty good for a cavalry unit. Speed of only 6, but they do have that flying wedge, which allows them to bump up their speed to a speed of 7. Apart from that, nothing really to talk about this cavalry unit. 100 men strong, coming from that first class population, of course. Your only option, so there's nothing much to discuss here. However, moving on to the next section, we have our spear units, and in our spear units, we begin with the Rorari. The Rorari are a reserve type of a unit. They come from the 3rd class population. Pretty decent stats for a 3rd class population unit. 8 armor, melee attack of 6, 15, so they're definitely more defensively oriented. The overall weapon damage is only 23, which isn't all that great. However, as a 3rd class unit, it is quite respectable, especially considering they have massive shields, which means they will be able to soak up a lot of the enemy missile fire. Would I really recommend using this unit? Not really, because of course you do have auxiliary units that draw in from the 4th class population, which is not only going to be much more easier to replenish after a battle, but also they have better stats, so nothing much to talk about the Rorari. Next up we have the Hastati, and keep in mind, in the core Roman roster I'm considering the Hastati Samnitiki, or the allied Hastati, or the Soki Hastati, or the Soki units as part of the core Roman roster, and that is simply because the Soki class in the game draw from the Roman population class rather than what was historically accurate. These guys would have been considered Peregrini or foreign population. However, in terms of gameplay balance, they pretty much share the same stats in the same population group. Now, speaking of the Hastati, they are Pop 2 units, so they come from the pleb class, and of course they have pretty decent stats. They have 20 armor, which is really respectable, 7 melee attack, 18 melee defense, and of course they have an overall weapon damage of 26, 4 of which is armor piercing, which is pretty respectable. A decent speed of 3, so they're really fast. They have a precursor javelin. Nothing over here that's that you wouldn't like. They even have the defensive formation, which means you can bump up their armor by 15, their frontal armor, from 20 to 35, which is really respectable. However, next up we have the Hastati Samnitiki. They're pretty much the Soki variant of the Hastati, or the core Roman Hastati. In the Rise of the Republic campaign, I kind of like these 2 units, and that is because they fulfill a niche. While the core Roman Hastati are more shock spear kind of a unit, the Soki variant are a anti-cavalry kind of a unit. However, in the base game, they're pretty much similar in terms of stats, except the Soki Suki variants are slightly inferior. As you can see, they have less armor of 15 as opposed to 20. And to be honest, they don't really benefit from coming from any other population class, so they are still population 2. So if you were to talk about more efficient choice, then of course the Hastati is better than the Hastati Samnitiki. However, even if you look at the bonuses, they have the pretty much same bonus versus cavalry and elephants, so nothing much to discuss over here with the Hastati Samnitiki. Next up you have the Principes. Now the Principes are basically another Pop 2 unit, 200 men strong, but they are significantly superior to both of the other units we covered. Of course, they have 35 armor, which is absolutely insane. The weapon damage is pretty much the same. The weapon stats are almost identical, so there's not much difference. The only difference being is, of course, their speed, so they are much slower to maneuver, so you have to watch out for that. However, they also have that defensive formation, which means you can pump up their armor all the way up to 50, which is really, really powerful, especially against, more disorganized enemy types. You definitely want to be using the defensive formation. However, if you're up against more professional phalanx units like the Hellenic factions and of course the Carthaginians, then you are going to be outmatched because they have better reach. So what you want to typically end up doing is you definitely want to be in a looser formation, so that of course they do not take that many casualties. They're a bit spread out, and therefore the phalanx formation that you're up against will not be able to attack many of your units. And by being a bit more spread out, then you kind of can envelop the unit from the sides and attack it from the sides. Next up we have the last option, which is the Principes Samnitiki, which is basically the Sokiai variant of the Principes. Once again, as opposed to the Rise of the Republic campaign where they fulfill a niche, these units are pretty much identical in stats. They come from the same population class. They have slightly inferior armor. Apart from that, they're pretty much identical. They do have a slightly better melee capabilities, with the melee defense being 19 as opposed to 18. And of course that weapon damage, that's a big positive over there. That I think something is wrong here, that I'll have to notify the Divided Impera team, because these guys have a significantly better weapon entry of 28 overall weapon damage, 4 of which is armor piercing, of course. And even losing that 5 armor kind of makes these guys a lot more desirable, in my opinion, now that I think about it, in comparison to the Principes, because they deal a lot more damage, they have a lot more melee defense capabilities, they have better bonuses versus cavalry and elephants. So yeah, definitely a better unit. I mean, the armor value of 30 versus 35 isn't all that different, because armor is not a flat value that's applied. Instead, every attack that manages to land on your unit kind of has a dice roll. And what that means is that if your armor is 30, you can roll anywhere between 1 to 30. And if you're lucky, you'll get the full value of 30, which means if the damage is overall weapon damage over here is, in this case, is 28, 4 of which is armor piercing, so that 4 will be applied. The other 24 will have to bypass this 30, and it's not going to be doing that because 24 is less than your 30. What that means is that this unit will not take damage. However, if this unit rolls a 1, then of course you'll be landing 24 minus 1, which is basically 23 plus the 4 armor piercing that ignores that, so that's overall of 27 damage to the unit. And each unit has about 65 to 80 health points if they're infantry units, of course. Depending on the type of unit, of course, Spartan units have better health and so forth, but for the most part they have about 65 to 70. So that what that means is 3 hits of like the one I last described, where you're dealing 27 damage, is enough to kill a unit. However, that being said, let's hop on to the next group, and we're talking about the phalanx type troops. And the phalanx type troops, you have 2 units. You have the Triarii and you have the Perites Extraordinarii. Both of these units come from that first class population. They do have the phalanx ability, emulating that Greek style of hoplite warfare. However, the equipment is very, very different, especially in the case of the core Roman Triarii. The Perites still have a resemblance to the hoplites with those aspis shields, of course. In terms of stats, once again, pretty much neck to neck. The only difference being is a base morale of just -1 in the case of the Petites Extraordinary. Overall, a decent stats for a Pop 1 unit. I mean, the melee attack and the melee defense is rather low in comparison to even the Principe Samnitiki, which is rather, astonishing. Apart from that, they have the same weapon entry as the Principe Samnitiki. And also, as far as their armor is concerned, they have pretty much the same armor, the maximum armor possible at 38. But keep in mind that the phalanx formation doesn't really improve your armor that significantly. I mean, it does a slight bit, a tad bit at 41. However, if you take, the Principes, both of the Principes options, of course, this one having 50 armor from that defensive formation, and this one having, of course, 45 armor, which is significantly more than the 41 of both of these units. However, these units are hoplite units, which means they're going to be really good against enemy phalanxes, as opposed to, of course, these units, which are not that great when it comes to formation on formation front. Toe-to-toe confrontation, of course. These defensive formation is really good against opposition that fight in loose formation, like melee swordsmen that do not have the ability of defensive formation. Next up, we have the skirmisher or the missile troops, and in that we have two options. We basically have the Ascensi and, of course, the levies. We don't yet have access to the velites. Those are a Polybian unit. Of course, both of these units, in my opinion, very generic units. So as far as missile troops are concerned, I wouldn't really rely on the core Roman options, of course. Both of these draw from the third class population. Both of these are 175 men strong. Both of these have very mediocre to below average stats, if you ask me. No melee capabilities whatsoever, so they're not going to be much use outside, of course, their skirmishing role. So I definitely would not recommend these units. Next up, we have our cavalry. In the cavalry, we have our equites. Now, equites are really inferior. They have 28 armor, 100 men strong, come from that first class population, and as a first class population unit, really inferior stats, guys. 8 melee attack, 11 melee defense, overall weapon damage of 31, which is pretty respectable, 3 of which is bonus versus cavalry, so quite obviously an anti-cav cavalry, and considering the fact that they have a spear and shield, so that further complements the fact that they are good against enemy cavalry. But of course, you are going to be surrounded by enemy cavalry that's vastly superior to yours. Of course, Hellenic world has a lot of shock cavalry, which, while they're not going to be able to do much against this unit in a prolonged melee fight, if the AI uses them in a right fashion and focuses a lot on multiple charges, then it can easily take care of this unit, especially considering their armor is really low. They have a respectable speed of 7, which can be bumped up to 8 using that flying wedge formation. However, next up we have the Equites Extraordinary. These are basically the Soki version of the Equites, which come from the allies. Soki basically mean allies, and they have pretty decent stat for a Soki unit, very comparable to, of course, your general unit over here. So they have the overall weapon damage of 31, 5 of which is armor piercing, pretty standard. 4 bonus versus cavalry. As far as overall stats are concerned, very, very, very similar. And so with that, we're pretty much covered, of course, the core Roman roster. Not much to see here, but we are going to hop on to the next part, where we are going to be talking about the auxiliaries available to the Romans during, of course, the Camillan and Polybian reforms. Alright guys, welcome to part 2 of part 1, in which we will be covering the Roman auxiliary troops. And as you can see, already such a massive difference. So this is where the Romans actually shine. Of course, the auxiliary troops give them access to a lot of different varieties. As you can see, we still have just the Roman general up front. We won't be talking about him, of course, but now we have a lot of melee troops. You can have a look at it. It's absolutely insane. We have about 10 different melee options to choose from, and keep in mind, this is not all of the options, because as you can see, we are almost 40 units in fact, and still there are a couple of units that I decided not to include in this section. Of course, we have our spear units, phalanx units, our missile units, our melee cavalry, quite a lot of options there. We have missile cavalry, and we even have access to some elephant units, which is rather nice. However, that being said, let us go through each and every single one of these units. The reason why I did not include some of the units in this section is because they're way too out of the way for you to get, especially in the early game. By the time you reach those regions, you should typically trigger your Marian reforms, which means that these auxiliary units will no longer be available to you. Instead, what you will have is access to Marian auxiliary units, which are in fact even better than these auxiliary units, believe it or not. However, that being said, let's hop onto the first group, which was of course our melee infantry, and the first option we have is the Libyan infantry. Nothing much to discuss over here. All of these units, keep in mind, come from the population class 4, which is why they are so powerful, which means you can pretty much have your entire army consisting of these units. Of course, each of these units have a campaign cap, so you can't just simply spam them out, but if you are trying to go for a historical playthrough, then you can pretty much have 50% of your army consisting of this population class 4 elite units. So by no means these units are levy. Of course, some of them are levy in terms of their capabilities, but many of them are pretty professional. So let us hop into each of these options one by one. I'm obviously not going to be telling each of these units come from population class 4. Just keep that in mind. Of course, we are going to be struggling for time since we have a lot of units to cover. However, that being said, let us talk about the Libyan infantry. Now, the Libyan infantry, very basic unit. I wouldn't really recommend these guys. Really poor melee attack and melee defense for a melee unit. Overall weapon damage is pretty respectable, with an overall of what am I looking at? I'm looking at 28, of which 12 is armor piercing, and of course they have that bonus versus infantry of 2, which bumps it up to an overall weapon damage of 30. The armor is 8, but they have decent shields, which means they will be able to soak missile fire, but I wouldn't really recommend this unit. Next up, of course, we have the Dacian Falsemen. As you can see, these guys are not going to be that accessible. You'll have to basically leave the Italian peninsula, gain a foothold in the province of Dacia, build an auxiliary barracks over there in order to gain access to these units. These Falsemen, pretty good unit, of course, 300 men strong. They have good melee attack, but really poor melee defense. They have no rail armor, which means they're extremely susceptible to missile fire, especially because of the lack of armor and of course their shields. But they are really offensive shock type unit, speed of 3, and overall weapon damage of a whopping 36, 11 of which is armor piercing. So really nice unit to have. If you can gain access to them, I think it's going to be really unlikely in your playthroughs, because by the time you get to Dacia, you typically should be in your Marian era, and that is because in the early game you're kind of forced to confront Carthage, as of course Divided Impera has a script which launches the Punic Wars, so you will be mainly focusing on the complete opposite direction, southwest. Meanwhile, to get a foothold in Dacia, you have to expand towards the northeast. Next up, you have the Germanic Assault Infantry. Now, these guys can be recruited in the provinces of Germania, of course, Magna Germania, Germania Minor. So Germania Minor is not that far off. It's slightly to your northwest, so it's more likely that you could get access to these troops. Now, these are pretty decent melee troops. They're almost akin to, of course, your Agrarian Axemen. They have very similar stats, slightly inferior stats, if I have to be honest with you. But for the most part, these guys have very similar stats to your Agrarian Axemen. 15 armor, overall melee attack of 9, melee defense of 10, which is respectable, nothing too fancy, but where they actually shine is the overall weapon damage of 31, with the inclusion, of course, bonus versus infantry, 14 of which is melee armor piercing, so really good against heavily armored units. Next up, we have the Asturian Axemen. You can't really see them over here because they have the guerrilla deployment and they are really good at hiding. These guys are also quite good, very comparable to, of course, if you can see stat wise, they only lack a little bit in terms of their morale, so they're very similar to, of course, your Germanic Assault Infantry. They are 300 men strong, like, of course, your Germanic Assault Infantry is just 200 men strong. So I would consider these guys to be slightly superior to your Germanic Assault Infantry, just because they have more men in the unit. These guys can be acquired from the province of Tarraconensis. So it is not that far out of your reach, especially if you go across Narbonensis and gain a foothold in the Iberian Peninsula. Next up, you have the Alpine Assault Infantry. These guys are actually really good. They have 20 armor. They're a little bit slower, which actually I kind of withdraw my statement. They're not as good because as a flanking troop. This is more of a flanking melee troop. Speed is really critical. So they have pretty much the similar stats in terms of melee attack, melee defense, weapon damage, but what they do lack is of course that speed. And now these guys can be accessed from the province of Raetia at Noricum, of course, which is just above Cisalpina, so they're not that far out of reach. You can easily acquire these guys. However, they're not as good as of course the previous two shock infantry that was mentioned. Next up, you have the Agrarian Axemen, and these guys are the clear winner. They have 2 ammunition or 2 precursor javelins in comparison to the other units. Of course, they're 200 men strong, really fast, good armor, good melee attack, better melee defense, better overall weapon damage, and these guys are absolutely insane. Some of my favorite units, and these guys are really easily accessible if you have control over the province of Macedonia, or even one region within the province. You can build an auxiliary barracks, gain access to these Agrarian Axemen. I believe you can get them from Macedonia, but if you can't, then you can get them from Thracia. Next up, we have the Celto-Hellenic infantry. Now, these guys are very different in comparison to the other units we mentioned. These guys are more like a frontline-ish type of infantry as opposed to a flanking shock infantry, and as you can see, their stats are very much catered towards it. They have decent melee attack, decent melee defense, armor of 30 of course, which is really respectable, movement speed of 3, once again very respectable, but unfortunately these guys do not have the defensive formation, which is, I think they should have had it. I think the Massilian version does have the defensive formation, so that's rather surprising that these guys don't have it, but I can understand for a balance reason as to why they don't have it. That would pretty much bump up their armor to 45, which would make these guys some of the most hardest hitting swordsmen in the early game, or the most well-versed swordsmen, kind of like an early Roman legionary unit. Next up, we have the Scordisi elite swordsmen. They are a little bit more easily accessible in comparison to, of course, your Dacian falsemen that come from Dacia. These guys come from Pannonia, which is a little bit closer to the Italian peninsula in comparison to Dacia. Now, these guys are absolutely badass. They have very similar stats to the Celto-Hellenic infantry in terms of their melee attack and melee defense, both at 13 and 11 respectively. Their bonus versus elephants is absolutely insane. So if you are up against like Carthaginians, for example, you can definitely use these guys to counter their elephant units. Of course, that plus 34 bonus versus elephant means that their overall weapon damage of 31, 7 of which is armor piercing value, which is really good. You're gonna add that to 34, so 31 plus 34 is 65 overall weapon damage, which is absolutely insane. What they do lack is of course speed, but that's okay because they are technically a heavy infantry type unit. Next up, we have the Germanic heavy infantry. These guys are, pretty good as well. They're very similar to the Scordisi elite swordsmen. They have slightly inferior melee stats. Their melee attack is slightly lower. Their melee defense is better, however, but where they really shine is their overall weapon damage of 35, of course 2 of which is bonus versus infantry, armor of 30, speed of only 2, so they're slightly it's really a comparison not with the Scordisi elite swordmen, but rather the Agrarian Axemen, and these guys have very similar stats if you look at it. So if you take a look at the Agrarian Axemen, you can see the melee attack, melee defense extremely identical. The only 2 things that are really differing is, of course, these guys have only 1 precursor javelin and they have a speed of 2, but they have superior armor. Meanwhile, the Agrarian Axemen have inferior armor but better speed and more ammunition. Given the choice between the 2, I would still go with the Agrarian Axemen, as once again armor is really a dice roll. But these guys are going to be really much better at taking ramparts than your Agrarian Axemen because they still have more armor. Next up, we have the Germanic heavy infantry. Now, these guys are very similar to your another variation of the Germanic heavy infantry. So you have 2 Germanic heavy infantry, but these Germanic heavy infantry are more defensive, frontline oriented. I mean, they have good melee attack, a decent melee defense, but their overall weapon damage is 32, 2 of which is armor piercing, of course. Overall armor of 30, precursor javelin. So really nice unit to have as well. Of course, to get access to any of these Germanic units, you will have to have a foothold in any of the Germanic provinces like Germania Minor, Magna Germania, or even Swabia, which Swabia, to be honest, is really out of the way. Magna Germania, you can get control over the province of or the region of Ubursis. Meanwhile, Germania Minor is a lot easier. You can get access to the province or the region of Vesontio and Aduarca. It's quite possible in the early game. However, next up we're going to talk about the spearmen options available, and in the spearmen options available you have the Ligurian spearmen. These guys have 20 armor, pretty similar stats to, of course, your Hastati with the speed. What they do lack is, of course, that precursor javelin, and of course they do not have that defensive formation, but they still come from that 4th class population, so it could be a worthy consideration. Next up we have the Gallic spearmen, slightly inferior in terms, however they do have better bonus versus cavalry and elephants in comparison to your Ligurian spearmen. Next up we have the Celtiberian medium spearmen. Now these guys are definitely the best option so far, of course, and that's only being because they have superior armor. Nothing much is really different between any of these units, with the exception, of course, of the armor value. You also have the Iberian Scutari spearmen, which are slightly inferior in terms of armor, but in terms of melee capabilities, they are much superior. They have 8 melee attack, they have 19 melee defense. They have an overall weapon damage of 28, which is really respectable, 4 of which is armor piercing, of course, 20 armor, which means they have slower armor, but they are faster moving at speed 3, 300 men in the unit, and a precursor javelin. So really nice unit to have, especially on your flanks or as to counter or dissuade enemy cavalry charges. Next up, of course, you have a phalanx options. You only have 3 options. You have the Massilian hoplites, pretty good unit, and of course you have the Spartan hoplites, pretty much similar. Nothing really spectacular about these units. They're not really equivalent to, of course, their Hellenic counterparts, but of course they do give you a very interesting unit to have instead of course, your core Roman Triarii and Pedites Extraordinary. You also have access to efficient pikemen. Now these guys you can only get if you control Asia, so it's not going to be that easy in the early game to gain control over the province of Asia, but in case you do, you can get access to these pikemen, and these pikemen are pretty mediocre as far as their stats are concerned. Only armor of 30, which is really low for a pikeman, and of course melee attack, melee defense really low, overall weapon damage only 26. So I wouldn't really recommend any of these phalanx type units, but it's really up to you as to what you want to have when it comes to these units. Next up, if you remember, as the Roman core roster, we really lacked in the missile department, but thankfully when it comes to our auxiliary options, as you can see, we have a lot of options. We have about 5, 10, 11 different options. So we're going to go through them really quickly. First up, we have the Ligurian skirmishers. They're going to be better than your levies or your levy skirmishers. That's because they have better missile damage and they have a bit slightly better melee capabilities. I wouldn't really say these guys shine in melee, but being Ligurian means you can easily access them from the province of Cisalpine Gaul. Next up, you have the Libyan javelin men, pretty much similar stats neck to neck. The only difference is these guys have some heat resistance as opposed to the Ligurian skirmishers. So nothing much really changed apart from that. So we don't really have to cover this unit as well. Next up, we have the Thracian pelters. Now these guys are obviously your best bet, your best option. The reason being is that they have very similar, missile capabilities. In fact, they have better shots per minute, which is really one of the most underrated stats when it comes to missile units. What this means is that this unit will be able to deplete its ammo a lot faster, but at the same time, that means if they have melee capabilities, they're going to be able to contribute to the battle with their melee capabilities. And speaking of melee capabilities, of course, these guys have the best melee capabilities of the previously mentioned, with a melee attack of 8, melee defense of 9, overall weapon damage of 23, which isn't all that much, of course. Next up, you have the Belgae Hunters, very generic low tier archer unit. You can gain access to them, of course, in the province of Belgica, so really nothing much to talk about these guys. Of course, let's just go ahead and make sure that all of these guys are not in melee mode so that we can see their weapons. So we were with the Belgae Hunters, really very generic archer unit, wouldn't really recommend these guys. Next up, you have the Germanic Hunters, similar to the Belgae Hunters, except they do have better guerrilla and of course stealth capabilities. They don't really have stock and they can't really fire while hidden, but they are better in terms of their abilities, as you can see over here in the bottom. Right, next up we have the Sardinian archers. Again, very generic archer unit, slightly better armor than the predecessors, armor of 8, which means they're going to be slightly better. However, their shots per minute is rather very slow in all of these units. 5 shots per minute, really bad for an archer unit. Next up, you have Numidian slingers. Now these guys pretty respectable, armor of 8, range of 190, missile damage of 11, decent melee capabilities, weapon damage of 23, so easily accessible, of course, in the province of Africa, which shouldn't be too far away from you. And keep in mind, these guys are not just Camillan auxiliary units. You can use them well into the Polybian era as well. However, once you trigger the Marian reforms, then these units will no longer be available. They will be replaced by the Marian auxiliary units, which we will cover in the 3rd video of the series, of course. However, these guys, pretty decent slinger unit, not amazing, slightly above average in my opinion. Next up, we have the the Mysian slingers in comparison to, of course, your Numidian slingers. These guys are slightly inferior in terms of melee capabilities, but slightly superior in terms of not missile capabilities, but rather because they have 10 armor, they're going to be slightly more better at... Actually, you know what? I just noticed these guys don't have shields, so definitely the Numidian slingers are going to be better than your Mysian slingers, which are available in the province of Asia. So these guys are way more accessible as well. Next up, you have Agranian Peltaste. Now these guys are, of course, the best skirmisher type unit that you can possibly have. Of course, they have 8 armor. They have similar missile capabilities in comparison to all of the other javelin type units that we mentioned. However, they do shine in their melee capabilities. 9 melee attack, 11 melee defense, which is really respectable for a missile unit. But what's more impressive is this overall weapon damage of 33, 14 of which is armor piercing. So they're kind of like the Agranian skirmisher version of the Agranian axemen. So very interesting unit to have, of course. Next up, we have Cretan archers. These guys are without doubt the best type of archer unit that you can have as the Romans before the Marian reforms. I don't think I need to explain much. You can see right away they have a shots per minute per 9, which is absolutely insane. They do have slightly lower range, but their missile damage is super high as well at 18, a lot of which I believe it's 6 or 4 is armor piercing. So one of the heavy hitting archer units in the game. And of course, they do have quite a lot of armor as well. They have an armor of 20. They don't have a lot of melee capabilities. However, they also do have a shield, which means they're going to be a lot more a lot better at handling missile to missile engagements, because they will have the ability. So even though these shields appear to be on their backs, they do contribute to the block chance versus enemy missile units. So what that kind of means is that these guys are going to be much better in missile to missile engagements, of course. Next up, we have the Balearic slingers. These guys are the best slingers you can possibly have. A range of 215, 13 missile damage, a lot of which is armor piercing. Being a slinger unit, you have 7 armor piercing, so these guys are going to be much better against heavily armored opposition. Of course, as opposed to archers, my personal preference always archers over slingers for several reasons. Even though slingers have a lot more ammunition as opposed to archers. Archers have only 15, slingers have 20, and slingers also have a lot more armor piercing and a lot more range, which means they're going to be really good against certain type of units, certain niche type of units where slingers would absolutely dominate as opposed to archers. For the most part, archers are more versatile. They have a higher arc trajectory of fire, which means they can fire from relative safety from behind your front lines. Meanwhile, slingers, they need a clear line of sight because their trajectories are a lot flatter rather than arched. So definitely archers are a lot better. Another thing with slingers is that their attack animation is what makes them inferior to archers. So if we compare the attack animation of a slinger versus an archer, I'm just going to do that real quick over here. We're going to get them out. So this is how a slinger would typically fire. So wait, hold on. Let's actually get this archer into position just to compare the animations real quick. You can just fast forward over there. Alright, hit the play button. There we go. Okay, so we have our slingers. We're gonna fire. Alright, and now see, they're gonna take out their slings. they're gonna wind it up, wind, and there we have it. That's their first volley, right? Now, if I, for example, try to move my slingers behind, let's say I cancel that attack and I try to move them behind because I'm trying to gain some distance between a unit that's trying to engage my slingers. Alright, and we kind of have to wait like 8 seconds or 5 more seconds for them to get into position. So, okay, just right about there. Alright, and now we have that. And now once again I issue an order to, like, you know, begin your missile capabilities. Once again they'll have to get into that animation, keep rolling it up and you know, firing into the enemy. This kind of you know, negates their ability to skirmish from a relative distance, or to kite the enemy unit from relative safety, because they take a lot of time to unleash their volley. So even though technically their shots per minute might be comparable to an archer unit, the animation itself is what sets them back. Meanwhile, when it comes to archers, let's take a quick look of the comparison. We just have archers firing, get into that bow position, release real quick. There we have it. Keep running behind. Let's fast forward it over here so the archers keep running. They'll have to run a little bit more. Okay, we're gonna slow down now. Okay, get the archers to quickly form up, fire. And what they're going to do is that they're really going to fire really quickly. I mean, this thing is not really showing it as well because, of course, there's no real enemy. It's more or less a command. But what ends up happening is that these guys are able to unleash at a lot faster rate. So that's just my personal take on slingers versus archers. However, next up we have our melee cavalry, and we have quite a lot of options, beginning with the Galatian light cavalry. Now, I know I include these guys, but these guys are going to be available in the province of Galatia and Cappadocia, which means most likely not in the early game. You're not going to be gaining access to this unit, and it's not really a very fantastic unit. For those of you who have seen my Galatian faction overview, you'll know that Galatians are not known for their cavalry, so let's not even cover those guys. Next up you have Ligurian cavalry, again very similar to the Galatian light cavalry. These guys, the only thing they have going for them is that they are 120 men per unit, but apart from that, really poor stats. Next up you have Thessalian cavalry. These guys are pretty respectable. They have that Thessalian horse entry, which means they have a much more meaner charge, very much shock cavalry, so they're not going to be all that good in melee, you know, prolonged melee combat, but they're going to be really good against infantry. As you can see, the bonus versus the infantry. Of course, they have really great speed, and they also have the flying wedge, which means they can move a lot faster. So I would recommend these guys if you are trying to play that hammer and anvil. Next up you have Celtiberian heavy cavalry. Now these guys are quite good, if honestly speaking. They are purely anti-infantry type of cavalry, decent armor 38, decent melee stats, low charge because they're not a shock cavalry. And they are not a cavalry that's anti-cav. Instead, they primarily focus on, you know, fighting out infantry. They have good overall weapon damage of 35, 3 of which is armor piercing, which means that these guys are a sword-based cavalry unit. And as a sword-based cavalry unit with speed of 7, that can in fact go into a speed of 8 if they go into that flying wedge formation. These guys are going to be really good at picking out enemy skirmisher units because they're going to be really fast. They're going to be able to you know, easily engage enemy skirmisher units, and of course they have a lot of armor, and they're as fast as most light cavalry in the game. So really nice unit to have. Lastly, of course, we have the Belgae heavy cavalry. These are the famous Maripos cavalry with the Maripos horse entry. By far one of the best cavalry options you can have as an auxiliary cavalry in the early game. Of course, these guys can be available in any Gallic province, including, I believe, Narbonensis. So if you do have a foothold in Narbonensis, you can get access to the Belgae heavy cavalry. But if not Narbonensis, then at least Aquitania, which means if you do control the settlement of Burdigala, at the very least, you can gain access to these units. So they're not that easily accessible. But if you can reach all the way into Iberia, then definitely gaining a foothold in the province of Aquitania shouldn't be too hard if you kind of dedicate some effort towards that endeavor. But as far as stats are concerned, these guys are absolute badass. Totally anti-cav cavalry. Of course, 10 melee attack, 17 melee defense, so really good at defense capabilities. That spear shield combination means they are going to be better against cavalry, as you can see reflected in their stats. They have a bonus versus cavalry of 4. armor of 38, speed of 7, which can be bumped up to 8 with that flying wedge formation. However, what's most important is that they have the Mariposa horse entry coupled with a high charge bonus. What this means is that these guys are some of the heaviest cavalry units available in the entire Western Hemisphere of the game. So these guys are going to have some of the meanest charge impacts possible in comparison to any of the other cavalries. Next up, we have missile cavalry, and we have 3 options. Keep in mind, as the Romans, you don't have any options for missile cavalry in your core roster. However, when it comes to auxiliary, you do have 3 options. You have the Gallic cavalry, nothing great. They're just 120 men strong. In fact, all of these units are 120 men strong. So I won't really be covering the Gallic cavalry because there's not much to explain over here. Meanwhile, you have 2 other very good options. You have the Numidian cavalry, and of course you have the Tarentine cavalry. And I'm going to compare them side by side just to save a little bit of time. The Tarentine cavalry slightly better in terms of their armor. In terms of melee capability, they're kind of slightly neck to neck as far as melee capabilities are concerned. In terms of skirmishing ability, definitely the Numidian cavalry is much better. They have better missile damage, more ammunition, good shots per minute. In terms of speed, I'm rather surprised that these guys have similar speeds, considering that the Numidian cavalry does have the Numidian horse entry, which means they should be technically faster. And we could do a foot race, but I'm not going to waste time, of course. We're going to try to hop on to the next section as quickly as possible. However, these guys do have the stalk ability, which is really useful, and they also have the snipe ability, which means they can fire while hidden. Next up, we have our 2 elephant options. We have the African elephants, which are a lot more accessible, and we have the Syrian war elephants. Of course, the Syrian war elephants, not that easily accessible. You'll have to basically conquer the province of the region of Syria, and in particular you'll need to hold the settlement of Antioch, which is the capital of the Seleucid Empire. So it's not going to be easy to get this in the early game, which means more than likely than not you're not going to be able to gain access to these elephants. And for those of you wondering what I did manage to do during my very long break, due to my health of course, and of course due to, you know, vacationing and all of that, what I did manage to do is like upgrade a lot of the assets, as you can see with this Syrian war elephants, this new armor that's like, you know, really beautiful. Like, just look at the quality of it, and this is going to be eventually introduced into the base game. Of course, I have updated all of the armors into that beautiful quality for the elephants, and of course I'm focusing a lot on overhauling the entire Mauryan faction appearance. And if I'm successful at convincing the Divided Impera team, I will be introducing a new system to the Mauryan armies as well. So I mean, that's just a little bit of a sneak peek on that. However, with that, we have covered all of the auxiliary units for the Romans, pre-Marian reforms, and we are going to hop on to the next section where we will be covering my recommended army composition for the Camillian Roman armies. Alright, welcome to the next section. It's already, we are about the one hour mark, so I'm going to try to make this as quickly as possible. What I would say is I'm going to skip part 4 of this video just to save time, because in the next video I can cover part 4, because in the next video I don't have to go through these auxiliary units again. However, in this section we are going to be covering my personal army composition recommendations for the Camillan Roman legions. As you can see, I have modified the roster available to the Roman faction just to reflect all of the Camillan options that we have available to us. However, we are going to face off against a early Carthaginian army, and as you can see, I have gone ahead and given the Carthaginian army a really elite army. They have good war elephants, not the best of course. They don't have Atlas elephants because I kind of typically tend to reserve them for the Polybian era. Decent Numidian cavalry. They do have Carthaginian citizen cavalry. They have Balearic slingers, which are really good. They have good melee units as well. Some Turios type spear units, and of course they have their core infantry, phalanx type infantry, consisting of Carthaginian hoplites, Libyan Phoenician hoplites, and of course the sacred band unit. However, with that, let's talk about my composition recommendations for the Romans. Now, there are 2 options available. You can either go for the for the more optimal or the best composition. However, in the polls, the more historical formation was recommended. So I'm actually going to be covering, I'm not going to be testing the optimal composition, but I will be testing the historical composition, and then you can just interpolate that if I was able to perform this well using an inferior composition, because keep in mind the historical composition is inferior in regards to, of course, the optimal formation, then that means if you roll with the optimal formation, you are going to be performing a lot better. So of course you're going to have the general's unit, and then you want to fill up your army with with a lot of Principes, because they are second class population. So these guys can form up your core infantry. You have about 4 of them, so that's great. Then if you want some spear units, I would recommend the best spear unit available are these 2 guys that you can use as counter cavalry units. Then as far as melee units are concerned, you can get a couple of Agrianians, or maybe even 4, or you could perhaps go with some Agrianian axemen. You can go with some Celto-Hellenic. It's really up to you, but I would suggest about 4 Agrianian axemen. I mean, for the memes, if you want, you could get Triarii. They're some of your best hoplites units available to you, of course. In fact, I wouldn't go for the Camillan Principes. I would actually go for the Samnitiki, because as we discussed earlier, these guys have better stats in comparison, so definitely would get the Camillan heavy spear maniple. As far as missiles are concerned, we could go for the Agrianian Peltas. Where are those guys? We have a couple of them as well. We could go for some Cretan archers, and you could kind of possibly replace Cretan archers with, of course, Balearic slingers. So it's really up to you. You either go with the Cretan archers or the Balearic slingers. I did not cover the Syrian heavy archers because, as I mentioned, they're going to be really out of the way. You want to get rid of course, those Triarii units, because they do come from that first class population. So as you can see, right now our entire army is almost foreign population class, with the exception, of course, of the Principes, Samnitiki, and of course your general's unit. Then you probably want to go for some cavalry units. You can go for the Maripos cavalry, and after the Maripos cavalry, you can actually get rid of one of these Principes Samnitiki. You can go for a missile cavalry, and the missile cavalry you can go for the Numidian cavalry. Of course, I could include elephants over here, but it's going to be really tough to gain access to elephants in the early game. You could go for an African elephant. Actually, it's going to be a lot better than Numidian cavalry at dealing with enemy cavalry. And since you have a good counter against enemy cavalry, you no longer need the Scutari spearmen. What you could do instead is perhaps gain a couple of hoplite units. You could go for the Spartan hoplites, or you could go for, of course, the more the more superior Triarii. The only difference being is, of course, which population class they draw from. If you go for the Spartans, they are from population class 4, so they're going to be a lot more easier to replenish. However, if you go for the Triarii, they're going to have better stats, but they come from that first class population, so you could go for the Spartan units. However, if you're looking for the optimal, most stat perfect army, then this is the composition I would recommend. So you have 2 elephants, 1 on each flank, with 2 cavalry on each flank. And you can use the elephant cavalry combo to counter enemy cavalry. You have Agrianian axemen on your flank, supported by Agrianian peltas on your flank. In fact, you can even use your Agrianian peltas, which are on your flank, to counter enemy elephants. You have Cretan archers as your missile units. You have a solid front line of Camillan Principe, Socii Principes. These guys have very good stats. Of course, armor of 30 can be bumped up all the way to 45 with that defensive formation, of course. And finally, of course, you have your more elite hoplite type units if you decide to ever use them. However, for the most part, I don't think they're necessary. They can even be replaced with Numidian cavalry or some fast moving light cavalry if you need. But really, I would really consider this to be an ideal or most optimal army composition, because you have a very versatile army. You have skirmishers, you have archers, you have cavalry, you have elephants, you have a core good front line of spears, and of course you do have melee capabilities. You can even replace a couple of these Agrianian axemen with the more heavier Germanic heavy infantry, so that these guys are better at scaling the walls, of course. However, in an open field battle, then the Agrianians will definitely shine a lot better than your Germanic heavy infantry. However, if you take a look at the entire army, you will see that the only core Roman units that we have are pretty much, I'm just going to rearrange that, are pretty much these units over there. So you have 1, 2, 3 population class 1 units, 4 population class 2 units, and the rest is all population class 4. It's foreign, so you can see almost 50% of the army is from that foreign population class. So as far as historical balance ratio is concerned, it's almost identical. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you have 2 of these guys, which would pretty much cover all the horsemen and the 2 archers, and then you're slightly above that 50% ratio with, of course, the Agrarian peltaste and the elephants. However, that being said, let us actually focus on the historical army composition. Now, in the historical army composition, you definitely want to go with the triple S axis formation. So I'm actually going to be showcasing how I do that, and in order to do that, I'm not going to be recording the replay. I'm going to be fighting the battle real time so that you guys can see how I micromanage the army. But before that, we're just going to hop back on quickly into the Carthaginian army, and you can just see how it is very similar to my optimal build. You have a couple of the Balearic slingers, you have that 4 units of the core frontline infantry, you have those 2 supporting spearmen, you have 4 melee units, you have 3 cavalries or 4 cavalries if you include the general, melee cavalry, 2 elephants to support either flanks, and of course you even have the Numidian cavalry, which is a skirmisher type fast moving cavalry. That's going to be actually the hardest cavalry unit to deal with. So in terms of the ideal army the historical army composition, of course you're going to go for the general's bodyguard, and now you're going to begin your triple S axis formation. Ideally you would have twice the number of Soki, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to ignore the Soki troops because they're not as effective as, of course, your non-Soki variants, with the exception, of course, of the Principes. So we're going to get some Hastati. 4 Hastati will form the front line, followed by 4 Principes Samnitiki, and after that we're going to get like a couple of Triari. So already you can see these 8 units are coming from population class 2, which is really not ideal. And in fact 4 of these population class units are vastly inferior in comparison to the Principes Samnitiki. However, as promised, we are going to go for the historical route. Then of course you can go for either a couple of the Grecian archers, but really we are not in any shortage of infantry units. What we will lack is, of course, the ability to snipe the enemies, as we will desperately need, especially against the Numidian cavalry. So I would recommend Balearic slingers over, of course, your Grecian archers. Although Grecian archers, to be fair, do have a faster rate of fire, so they can dispatch off Numidian cavalry a lot faster. So we get a couple of those guys. Then apart from that, we want some peltaste units. Can go for the levies, which is the more historical option, but better than the levies we either have the Libyans or we have the Ligurians. So we're gonna go for the Ligurians because historically they would be kind of in the employ of the Romans at the time frame, kind of. So we're going to go for Ligurians because they're definitely going to be better than your Levy Javelin men. Of course, the best possible option is your Agrarian Peltaste, but we don't have access to the Agrarians. And as far as cavalry is concerned, we can't really use any of the auxiliary cavalry because we will not have access to them. What we have is a choice between the Soki or the Equites Extraordinary and the Equites, and we know that the Equites Extraordinary are superior. So there we have it. We have 4 cavalry. The rest of our army is slowly filled out. Very historical over here. You can see that about almost 50% of the army is coming from the foreign population class. We have about 2 more slots to fill, and right now we can do anything. We can pretty much go for a couple more archers like this or we could go more melee heavy, and that's exactly what I'm thinking of doing. I want to go more melee heavy, so I could possibly go for more Triari. That's pretty much the only option I really have. Or what I could do is try to get some Roari, some reserve Maniple to kind of help against the elephant units, which is not really going to be that great, to be honest. Getting 4 Triari, my main opposition to this is, of course, a lot of strain on your first class population, because then you have 8 units from your first class population, and historically speaking, the number of triarii was half the number of hastati or principes, so this seems to be more accurate. So I think the play would be to get maybe one more archer, that's for sure, I think. And we could get one more Ligurian skirmisher, because they're going to be really effective against enemy elephant units. But nah, really confused as to what to do over here. I could go for the Roari, since they actually don't hold any position in the army that's of note. But really keeping in mind historical army composition over here makes it a little bit harder to pull it off. We could go for Numidian cavalry or even Tarentine cavalry, because that is kind of historical. I think Tarentine cavalry would be the play, so let's actually go for Tarentine. Now, you know what? Roman cavalry was a lot of the times inferior and lesser in number in comparison to the Carthaginian cavalry, so really haven't thought this through. Alright, going for the... Let's actually go for a couple of the Ligurian skirmishers, I think. Because that is really going to help against the elephant units that we have to deal with. Yeah, alright. I think I'm happy with this. So with that, we can quickly go into the next section of the video, in which we will be facing off against the Carthaginian army up ahead. Alright guys, welcome to the battle. This is of course part 3, which is going to be the final part of this video. We will be covering part 4 in the next video of the series, of course, in which we will be covering my recommended general skills as well as army traditions for the Roman faction, of course. However, in this part we are going to test out our Roman formation against the Carthaginian enemy. I have decided eventually to go for the extra triarii instead of the Ligurian skirmishers. But what I am going to do is, of course, I'm going to fight this battle in real time, so you guys can see how I micromanage my armies, what kind of decisions I take on the battlefield and so forth, and more importantly, how I manage the micromanagement and the macromanagement side of things when it comes to the army. So the first thing you want to do is set up your cavalry on the flanks. So we have our general and we have you know, our other equites extraordinary on the flanks, and then we are going to set up our skirmisher units, followed by our Cretan archers, and then we want to create our Tripolis axes. Now when it comes to the Tripolis axes, of course you have 3 rows of units. You have the hastati, the principes, and of course the triarii. A lot of people will do this literally manually, like they'll start moving things across, and then it's like, you know, it's very inefficient to do so in this fashion. You know, it's like okay, so there you have it. And even so, there's still a unit over here. So this is one way to do it, and as you can see, it took like a really long time, and it's not exactly accurate. The way I like to do it is I like to keep in mind that these units have defensive formation. So let's just take a look at the hastati. So here's what happens when you use the defensive formation. You have gaps that form up in between these units. So technically you can never get rid of this gap. Like, you know, even if you drag it out, you know, at the maximum width, you will always have those gaps. But what you can do is you can hold down the control key, hit the down arrow key, reduce the formation width, and now they have a continuous line. So these guys form a continuous line of phalanx type units. Instead of the hoplite ability, they do have the defensive formation ability, which actually improves their armor value by quite a significant amount. But what you want to do is you want to form that iconic checkerboard formation of the Tripolis axis, and the best way to do that is to actually select units in a chronological order. So the way to do that, so let's just quickly set up our principes right here behind. The way you want to do that, hold down the control key, first deselect any of the units, hold down the control key, and then chronologically select a hastati unit followed by a principes, hastati, principes, hastati, principes, hastati, principes. Hit the G key so that you form them up as a group, and as you can see, they are now in alternative formation. Click on the battle map, and as you can see, now they have formed up in that alternate formation. I mean, hastati principes, hastati principes. Easy way to tell is, of course, this icon: medium spearman, heavy spearman, medium spearman, heavy spearman. And now what we want to do is toggle on that defensive formation, reduce the formation, and you know, select them over there, up there in the front, deselect that formation, and what we can do is now select all of the Principes, hit the G key so that they are part of a new group, the Principe groups, and move them up behind. And as you can see, that checkerboard formation kind of formed up. That leaves us with only the Triarii left. With the Triarii, the way to go about it is to group them all into one group, kind of spread them out as much as you can. All right, and the way you want to position them is you want to position this gap between the Triarii exactly in line with the flag of the Principes. So there you have it. Now once you have that done, just hold down the control key and reduce the formation width, and as you can see, the Principes, the Triarii kind of formed up in that triple S axis formation. So very easily you can just manually adjust it over there. And now if we take a look at the map, you can see we have our triple S axis formed up nice and easy. Next thing you want to do is select the entire army, hold down the guard stand so that they don't get out of position. As far as the cavalry is concerned, you can go with the wedge formation, but I think the wedge formation has a lot of drawbacks. So instead, what I am going to do is just reduce their width a little bit so there's a little bit of gap between them and they can maneuver a little bit better. We're going to select the whole army and put them up a little bit ahead. Keep in mind, we are on the offensive, which means the Carthaginians will hold their ground and they won't attack us. We'll have to attack them. And that's pretty much what I always do in these battles, is because most of the times you are the ones initiating the battles in the campaign, and it's very rarely that the AI attacks you instead, especially if you're playing your cards right. So in most of these parts of these videos, I am on the offensive while the enemy is on the defensive. Now I'm going to select our whole army with the control A, select any of the unit, keep holding down that left mouse button while you do so, and you can drag them up forward. As you can see, all the way front on where the formation is, you can see 2 yellow arrows that's showcasing that they're going to run into position. What you want to do is hold down the control key, and now that converts into one singular arrow, which means they will walk into position, which is very important if you want to maintain your army's cohesion. And let's be honest, it looks absolutely badass. And as you can see, the entire triple S axis in full swing. Meanwhile, while your army is doing that, you can spend some time to get a grasp of what the enemy formation is all about. You have a couple of cavalry on the flanks, on either flanks, supported by elephant units. These guys are threat number 1, followed by a Numidian cavalry, of course, since we don't really have a counter to the Numidian cavalry, and I'm not entirely sure where the Numidian cavalry is, and that is because they have the stalk ability, which is really useful, so they could be just about anywhere. But as soon as I discover them out, we'll have to deal with them. Meanwhile, we have our core of the Carthaginians. They are flanked by some phalanx type units. Of course, they have some reserve units, which I can kind of sort of see over here, and of course a reserve hoplite unit. And all the way out in the front, they have their Balearic slingers, of course. So let's just quickly start to deal with them now. Obviously, you know, there's a big debate as to how exactly the Roman triple S axis kind of worked, and you know, was it really used in combat, like, you know, as it was said it was used? To be honest, yes and no. There are instances of some battles where kind of like the Romans kind of merged things, were very creative with their way of fighting, especially if you consider the Battle of Munda, I believe, where Scipio Africanus defeated the brother of Hannibal on the battlefield. Kind of, you know, formed up every day, kind of fooling the Carthaginians into establishing themselves into a particular formation, and then on one final day, he kind of formed up his army in a complete counter formation earlier than the Carthaginians, immediately as they had their breakfast. So what ended up happening, the Carthaginian troops had to form up in battle formation without having their breakfast. They were sleep deprived, hungry, and of course they were, you know, formed up in a very ill fashion. Excuse me. And the Romans were much better you know, equipped to deal with the counter. So although I could fight with the typical Hastati first, Principe second, Triarii third, as the triple S axis more, you know, is more of a trope. As far as the game is concerned, keep in mind Hastati and Principes both come from the second class population, so I don't really want to expend my Hastati and have them break before my Principes can get involved, because as far as the campaign implications are concerned, I will have to replenish all these guys with second class population, so they are not that easily replenishable. However, in Rise of the Republic, of course, you can totally do that, because these guys come from that third class population. However, what I am going to do is I'm going to take the liberty of rearranging my army, and what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to deal with the elephant threat first. So what we're going to do is we're slowly going to move up our principes, and we're going to support them with a unit of Ligurian skirmishers, of course. Meanwhile, we're just going to select all of these units again, just move them across. And pretty much the same thing over here. Let's just move them a little bit across. So now these, we're creating an immediate right and left flank, which is kind of my favorite formation, to be honest, because it allows me a lot more maneuverability on the battlefield and a lot more response time. You know, if I'm winning in the center, I can support the immediate left or the immediate right. If I'm winning anywhere, I can easily gain a numerical superiority very easily with this formation. So straight off the bat, we're getting out of that triple S axis formation. We're creating a decent enough gap for us. And now what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to encourage the enemy elephants to take the bait and try to attack us. Meanwhile, with our Cretan archers, we're going to toggle on that skirmish mode, and the reason being is if the elephants take the bait, they're going to fall straight into my triarii trap supported by our skirmisher units and be absolutely wiped out. However, if they decide to charge to my center, I need my archers to get out of position to get behind into the relative safety of my spear wall. However, with that, let's just quickly take a look at the battlefield. You want to keep zoomed out so you get a comprehensive view of what's going on. Keep in mind, some of this Carthaginian cavalry is extremely fast, especially those guys, so they will be able to catch up to my Roman cavalry. So you've got to be very careful, especially Numidian cavalry. There you have it. You have one of the elephant units taking the bait, the other one taking a bait as well.
Our general is under attack.
So we're really gonna try to move, and as far as right now is concerned, we can go into wedge formation so that we are a little bit faster as far as maneuvering is concerned. And we kind of want that as long as we're maneuvering, but when we get into combat, we want to quickly change that. So very quickly over here, we're going to try to form up our triarii to counter those elephants. Quickly move up our other triarii, and we're seeing the Balearic slingers kind of try to make their way towards us. What we're going to do is select our entire army, keep moving them behind. Alright, perfect. And we're going to try to move our cavalry in a way that they can deal with the Balearic slingers. So we're trying to get two birds in one stone over here. And I see that this elephant unit is kind of locked on to this. And of course they are getting kind of funneled in towards you know, the center, which is not the worst of things, to be honest, and get the cavalry out of dodge. Meanwhile, this elephant unit is kind of stuck in, so we're going to go into phalanx formation quickly over here. We're going to move up our principes entirely up front, move our archers behind. Come on, Cretans, move up behind, toggle off the fire at will. The elephants are actually wavering, they're going berserk, which is actually great news for us. Now quickly get our general over there. We can get out of that formation, and over here we're doing quite well. We got the elephant properly in our triples axis formation, and these archers, really, they had this skirmisher mode, but for some reason they decide to like stick over there. So zero idea as to why that is. Sometimes it's just the way how things are, but meanwhile our cavalry has gotten clear. Just need to get rid of that one elephant unit. Meanwhile our archers doing fine, they're pretty much safe now, so I'm pretty happy. Meanwhile this elephant unit still needs to be kind of dealt with, and they're out of control, but they're still putting up a fight. Meanwhile we can use our triarii, we can move our triarii now behind completely, dealt over there, get our cavalry out. Okay, we've dealt with one of the enemy elephants, we've dealt with another one. What we're going to do is move quickly for the Balearic slingers. So let's just go out, get out into formation. We can move our triarii behind, and the elephants really packing a punch into this triarii unit for some reason. Really unfortunate that they weren't entirely destroyed, but the good news is our cavalry is making that charge for them, so they should really rout after this charge. Should take quite a lot of damage over there. So there you have it. Our general can go ahead, attack over there. We have another bunch of Ligurians, we can move them behind, get our triarii behind as well, and of course we're dealt with that other elephant units. So all in all, a very good start to the battle. We can move this triarii unit, get them all out of formation, move them all out behind. It's perfect. Move out our cavalry real quick out of the way so that our triarii can get into position, back into position. And what we're going to do is we're going to move our entire front line up ahead real quick. We're going to get our archers as well up ahead, behind, and into relative safety. We've dealt with that one Balearic slinger, so we're going to try to deal with the other Balearic slingers, get our cavalry. We're going to try to surround the enemy general over here and then charge in from all sides. So right now the battle is going really in our favor. What we want to do is reform our triple axes, select all our principes, move them up behind. So that's perfect. Our triarii can meanwhile just form up over here. So once again, that's kind of perfect. Get our cavalry into position. So we've dispatched 2 of the Balearic slingers, we've dispatched 2 of the enemy cavalry. Things are looking really good for us. The Carthaginians have no missile capabilities whatsoever, with the exception of course of their Numidian cavalry. So yeah, things are not looking really good for the Carthaginians right now. Meanwhile, our triarii, they have seen the brunt of the fighting, so we're gonna have to deal with that real soon with trying to giving them some well-deserved rest. We stretch them out. We're gonna reduce the formation real quick, form them up once again, triple axes back into formation. There we go. So that's a beauty of the triple axes. It's extremely maneuverable, and what we're going to do is we're going to charge this general from all sides. You can take a quick look at the charge. So it's just going to be absolutely devastating for this general unit. There we have it, from all directions, completely surrounded. Unfortunately, this general unit is pretty tanky, 45 armor, so it's not going to be an easy fight, but we are just going to sit back and relax and just watch how things unfold. Meanwhile, we get both of our skirmishers together. They can be in reserve now. Accretion archers looking quite good. So what we want to do is eventually slowly move up our formation back into position. Meanwhile, the enemy general has completely broken, so that's great. He's not yet completely wiped out, but we have to kind of deal with him. And now here's where things can get chaotic. So even though we have quite a significant advantage in the battle, we still have a disadvantage in the fact of the Numidian cavalry. They are going to be without doubt the most dangerous of units that we will face off against. So the way we want to handle this, guys, the way we want to handle this is first try to discover where exactly those units are. So we're going to pull out our cavalry since they are done their job, move them up onto either flanks, get back into position. And there you have it. Okay, we're getting back into position.
We have discovered the enemy's hidden units.
And sorry about that, it was just a fire brigade. In any case, alright. So we're getting them back into position. Our formation's starting to look good, back to the triple axis. And you can see just how maneuverable the triple axis really is because of this. And we've discovered some of the Numidian cavalry. They're on that right flank. So what I'm going to try to do over here is I'm going to try to lure them out, but I don't want any of my significant units taking some damage. So we're going to try our level best. And we know the fighting is going to be very cavalry intensive on that right flank, because you can just see there are 4 cavalry units over there on that right flank. So we really want to deal with those cavalry units. Meanwhile, the left flank has a singular cavalry unit. So the idea over here is to try to counter that cavalry formation on that right flank. So the way we're going to do it, we're going to form up all of our missile units over there. Meanwhile, these guys very quickly select our whole formation, move them a little bit to the left so that our cavalry over here can easily pass through them, can really get out, and then we can just move our entire formation back to where they were. They should take some time to move back. There we have it. We managed to move our cavalry really quickly because of that little bit of micromanagement movement. So it's very important to maneuver. It's really underrated. As you can see, we barely took any losses. We've dispatched 2 elephant units, a general unit, both of their Balearic units. So we've killed 5 units. We've lost about 50 men, guys. So, and we're not even using the ideal army composition, to be honest. And I'm really scared of this cavalry because they have like crazy speed. So We gotta be very careful as to how we approach this. Meanwhile, we can just keep moving up a little bit over here. I mean, it could be viable to get rid of the cavalry on that flank, since, you know, we could play it asymmetrically over here. But in case we don't, we have to be ready. Now, the way I want to play this is I actually want to, because you have a mix of melee cavalry and missile cavalry over here, so I want to be able to hit the missile cavalry with, of course, my own missiles. And there you have it. You have another bunch of cavalry trying to get towards us. So we're going to try to form up over there. And here we have it. We have a melee cavalry followed by a melee cavalry. So it's about time to charge over here. Go ahead, charge over there. You guys, you will need to charge these guys, definitely. The general, you can kind of move around. Okay, let's take a look at what's happening over here. This cavalry is trying to get in and around, but it's, of course, against a triarii unit. Let's select our triaries, put them in complete reverse formation so that they protect our flanks. Now, meanwhile, these guys can get back into their formation real quick. And we're just going to have a look at what's happening over here. Go ahead, hit there. Okay, so we're having a bunch of interesting developments on the right flank. Meanwhile, on the left flank, we managed to engage our triarii. We managed to reform our front line, so that's looking great. What we can do is just very quickly move up our principes if you want to make it perfect again. Alright, and we're going to move up our archers over here quickly. Come on, keep chasing these guys. Keep chasing these guys. Keep chasing these guys. We want them to lose kind of decisively. Very quickly select all of these units. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There we go. Hit them up front. Move them behind. Double tap, and move these guys behind. So there you have it. Perfect. Perfect formation. It's done. Oh, no. Definitely didn't mean for that to happen. These guys are routing, so you can just basically go for these guys. Cavalry engagements looking good. Triarii, just form up. You're gonna keep attacking. We're just gonna give attack orders so that this cavalry over here is the only real danger to us right now. What we're gonna do is move up this other cavalry. Meanwhile, all of our cavalry over here is done well with the Carthaginian cavalry. So as you can see, with the proper maneuvering, we have managed to completely negate almost all of the Carthaginian strengths. So that is exactly how you want to play this, and I don't really care about this cavalry unit, to be honest. Over here, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to hit the Numidian cavalry if we possibly can, because we want to get rid of the Numidian cavalry. Once we have taken care of the Numidian cavalry, it's pretty much in the bag. There we go. Just enable the hoplite formation so that we are a lot more difficult to pass by. And as you can see, they're getting bogged down. We're going to quickly enable that hoplite formation. So we've gotten rid of yet another cavalry unit. Quick look at the battlefield. Things are looking great, which means I can just dedicate my right and left flank back to being right and left flank. So just quickly move back out. The danger over here is Numidian cavalry can potentially attack my missile units in a melee. So that's ideally what we want to be trying to do. We're going to select all of these guys, put them on skirmisher mode, because we're starting to see some movement over here. Meanwhile, the cavalry on the left flank, you go all the way to the left flank. The triarii, you have done quite well. These guys are completely shattered, no use going for them. Get the triarii back into position real quick. Alright, we're moving out. And of course, we're seeing that our right flank is kind of getting overwhelmed, so we're going to move our right flank. Maybe this guy, you've seen enough of the action, we'll put you in a separate group. These guys, meanwhile, come up ahead, get into position, because we're going to have to form that solid front line real quick. Meanwhile, the Hastati, you can already form into your defensive formations real quick. Get into that defensive formation. There we go. Perfect. General can keep moving out and about. Okay, we're going to form up a little bit in behind and then form up our defensive formation with our principes real quick. So there we have it. We have a continuous front line, and we're going to move up our triarii as well. Things are looking quite good. We just need our archers to focus on those Numidian cavalry. We have dealt with one Numidian cavalry, which means we have to deal with the other. We're going to move our cavalry around the enemy as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, our Ligurians, not much they can do. They're pretty useless now. Don't have a lot of melee capabilities. But we're going to get our Cretan archers. We're going to get them into position to deal with the Numidian cavalry. Meanwhile, as you can see, we have kind of stabilized our front lines, so we're going to just keep pushing. We're going to ignore the Numidian cavalry because we have our Cretan archers to do just that. And we get our triarii into position. We don't really need to use them right now. And there we have it. These guys are charging. Perfect. Numidian cavalry should really lose against my own cavalry. Because they're not that great in melee. Meanwhile, this cavalry, move him up. We're going to start cycle charging this unit. Try to break their left flank. That's where they're the weakest. Right flank, they have quite a bit of units, so we got to be a little bit careful. Instead, since this Numidian cavalry is already engaged, let's start moving our Cretan archers around. So we're going to keep holding the shift key. We're going to try to move them around. You can go ahead, charge at this Numidian cavalry. Go ahead, rear charge over here. You can actually rear charging a phalanx unit is super powerful. Over here you see this unit's not really engaged, so we get out of the defensive formation, form him up in a narrow formation. This is the flexibility of the manipular formation at play. We move him up ahead. You can charge over here because there's no real space for you to maneuver. And there we have it. Okay, we've dealt with this one unit. We're dealing with that left flank as well. We're going to go ahead, charge over here. And this is the ideal time to engage our battle rhythm. We're going to charge into the flanks of this phalanx unit right over there. Meanwhile, our Cretan archers slowly but surely getting into position. That's exactly what we would like to see. Meanwhile, get over there, charge into the enemy, get into the flanks. This hoplite unit it's very easy to flank and destroy a hoplite unit, so that's exactly what we're going to try to do. Our cavalry unfortunately is taking quite a bit of casualties in melee, and right now we don't need to be in defensive formation anymore because we're right now in a situation where we can outmaneuver the enemy, and that's exactly what we kind of want to do because of course they have better phalanx units, so we don't want to get stuck with the defensive formation. We want to just outmaneuver them. So get our cavalry completely out. Let's reform. Let's reevaluate. Meanwhile, these guys over here, they're being attacked. Form up in the hoplite formation. These guys can move out. Go over there. We can use our Ligurians to kind of pin down this unit. Keep moving out. Let's see what is cavalry up to. Okay, nothing much. We've managed to completely break off their left flank. So quickly get our units into position. We've even managed to break this unit. We move back. Get out of defensive formation. Meanwhile, just keep attacking over here. Cretan archers, go ahead, shoot in the backs of these units. And you guys can come here as well. What we're going to do is we're going to attack you now from all sides. Go ahead. So there you have it. You see the battle is almost won. It's not going to be that difficult now to deal with the enemy. We're pretty much surrounded on all sides. This Cretan archer can fire into the backs of this unit. Meanwhile, this Cretan archer over here is firing into the back of that unit. We get our general cavalry over there, perform a rear charge over here. We get him out a little bit clear. Go ahead. Now these guys can go ahead and start hunting some of the enemy units that are in full retreat. So as you can see, Carthaginian lines slowly but surely crumbling. Nothing much they can do about it. Meanwhile, just let's zoom in and see what exactly is happening over here. These guys are attacking the rear, so we can move up our triarii and get these guys out of defensive formation so they're a little bit more relaxed. Meanwhile, these guys can come up front, try to use the gaps, and as you can see, we've already won the battle fairly easily, fairly good, taken very little losses. And with that, I'm just going to end the battle, and I will see you all in the end battle statistics. Alright, so there you have it, an absolutely decisive victory. Just 400 losses. In fact, I'm really impressed as to how well we fought that battle. Barely any losses, to be honest, and we actually outperformed the Carthaginians in every possible way. I mean, just look at the elephants combined. About 70 kills, which is nothing. Meanwhile, our triarii didn't get a lot of the kills, but they did quite well. Our most decent performing unit is actually a Hastati unit, very surprising. We barely took any losses to our first class population. Unfortunately, one of our equites did take a bit of losses. It's going to be hard to replenish. Second class population took a little bit of damage with this Hastati unit kind of being attacked on that rightmost flank by multiple, phalanx units. Of course, we managed to kill only 1,600 units of the Carthaginians, but of course, if we continued the battle, we could run them down. Meanwhile, their own cavalry severely underperformed in comparison to our own cavalry. Of course, one of our equites, including our general, best performing unit in the entire battle, 300 kills each. Of course, if you consider that, that's pretty much almost 50% of the entire casualties, and in fact that number will in fact grow, because these cavalry would pretty much hunt down all of these slower moving hoplite units that would decide to flee from the battle. However, with that, you can see the enemy hoplites didn't manage to rack up any high kills. The Balearic slingers were pretty much caught out of position. So once again, you would have noticed in that triple S axis formation, I actually had a lot of maneuverability. So it is viable, guys. It is viable, but of course you don't have to fight typically Hastati first, followed by Principe second. You can use the triple S axis to maneuver the battlefield very effectively, and that's exactly what I was doing. I was moving up my infantry here and there, very disciplined Romanesque style of fighting, and then starting to move my units where they were needed in the battlefield. That was the whole point of triple S axis, guys. The point of triple S axis wasn't Hastati first, Principe second, Triarii third, as you know, that is debatable, but the real point of the triple S axis was maneuverability. It's because the Romans who fought previously in a phalanx formation realized in their wars against the Samnites that they had to be a lot more flexible on the battlefield, that each and every single maniple needed its own decision-making capability, so that they can reinforce certain areas of the battlefield as per the requirements or how the battle progressed. So that is typically how I would consider a historical use of the triple S axis, is that maneuverability, is that flexibility, which is not really possible if you're playing with, let's say, a Hellenistic style of pike frontline. You pretty much just hammer and anvil at that point of time, right? Like everything in this game is technically a mini hammer and anvil, where you're kind of trying to outflank enemy units. But when you say hammer and anvil from the point of view of Macedonian style of warfare, it is considering a hammer and anvil in the grand scheme of things. So you have infantry to pin down an enemy front line, and cavalry to hammer down on the rear of that enemy front line. However, in the case of what I'm saying, hammer and anvil or flanking maneuvers, as you could see in this battle, there were a little bit of mini flanking maneuvers, getting out of defensive formation quickly, encircling an enemy, trying to get them to break, trying to show that we have local superiority, and then using those free units, using those gaps to further exploit weaknesses in the enemy formation, which is what we did. Of course, we managed to counter the enemy elephants very effectively. Despite that, it's exactly what I said it was. As you can see, the two most dangerous units actually racked up the most kills for the Carthaginians. Of course, none of the melee units were of primary concern. None of the hoplite type units were of primary concern. Of course, the spearmen did quite well against us, but of course, the elephants and the Numidian cavalry, as expected, were the most dangerous units on the battlefield. And this is a very important part of playing Rome 2, is that you identify what the threat is, and then you try to deal with that threat as best possible. Of course, I would be able to deal with the Numidians a lot more effectively if they didn't have cavalry superiority, so that actually kind of set me back, and I didn't really realize the losses I took with this cavalry unit was I was too overconfident and kind of allowed them to stay in combat for a bit too long, and I think it was against this spear unit. So I kind of lost a bit of this cavalry, but ideally I shouldn't have lost that many cavalry as well. So all in all, a very good battle, very, very decisive victory against a massively superior army. Believe me, if I had this army fighting off against this army, I would be absolutely able to crush this army with less than 200 losses. But of course, it's the enemy AI, so you're going to have an advantage against the enemy AI. However, with that, I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you liked the video, then like the video, and don't forget to subscribe if you're interested for more. Peace and love.